Would you be participating, or I'm doing everything mainly?
I would be participating as in terms of asking questions and
Okay,
you
fair
know,
enough. Would you be participating, or I'm doing everything mainly?
we're live, okay?
I would be participating as in terms of asking questions and
Okay, fair enough.
Good. I think we're live now. Hey everybody, good afternoon. Welcome to Code with
we're live, okay?
I don't know what happened.
Just an advice: if you're looking at the live stream, well, you need to mute the sound from it.
Okay. All right, let's go ahead again. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Code with Sam and Narendra, live stream on YouTube this afternoon. And this afternoon, we're going to be looking at intro to version control using Git. So we're going to talk about open source software and how is it you can use Git to actually upload your code, create a profile, and do some of the necessary tasks that is required to get you to operate functionally on Git. So on my team, I have with me is the other person, Narendra, who will be leading this afternoon session with us. So over to you, Narendra.
Yes. Okay. Thanks for the introduction, Samantha. And we will be, as Samantha mentioned, we will be covering today. We'll be mainly covering an introduction to version control using Git, which is our topic for today. So I'd like to go over the agenda we will be looking at today. First, we'll be talking about version control. Then we'll be speaking about some specific software and online website through Git and GitHub. And going into it, we would talk about, we can go through the process of installing and configuring Git on your computer. We would also talk about how is it you sign up for GitHub. We would also then look at understanding the Git workflow, so you're aware of how is it you utilize the software. And lastly, we'd get a little practical in exploring using Git and GitHub for version control. And as part of doing this, we'll be doing some various practical applications, various practical activities, sorry. And that would be, we'd look at working with repositories, we'd look at working on open source projects, and lastly, we'd be looking at using the GitHub workflow. So version control. The first thing I'd like to talk about is, what is version control? Version control essentially allows you to track and manage different versions of source code or a code base. And it essentially allows you to track changes. And when I say track changes, it would be, I'll get a little more specific. It'll allow you to track who did what. It'll allow you to track what was done. It will allow you to track why it was done. It will allow you to also track when it was done. So how is version control used for team collaboration? Now, speaking about tracking changes, so think about an example where you have a project and there are various different developers working on this specific project. And let's say, for instance, one developer is working on a feature and another developer is working on a separate feature. You don't want there to be a situation where a change is made on the master code base and then a developer, a second developer is working on something that is conflicting with what is already there. And also, you don't want a developer to be waiting on someone else to finish, and then they can be able to access the master branch. So how is it used for team collaboration? Git is essentially used for team collaboration by having a master code base, And then you have persons working on the project. They would make copies to their environment that they're working on. And then once they finish working on a feature or whatever it is they set out to do, they would send back their changes to the code base, but is not automatically implemented right away. There's a process that allows for the changes to be reviewed and ensure that everything is done as required. And then it can, once everything is okay, it would be integrated within the final build. Now, advantages of version control. I may implicitly mention some of them before, but I have two main advantages of version control. One is easy for multiple persons to work on the same project. And two, something that I didn't mention is that, let's say, for instance, someone made a change to a project and it went through the review process and everything went through to production. And then a unique issue arrives that was not picked up or tested. Then the version control would allow you to revert to an old version of the code base. So we also will be looking, we'll now move on to looking at Git and GitHub. And Git and GitHub essentially are the software and online system which allows us to utilize version control. So we'll first look at installing and configuring Git. First thing we'd look to do is talk a little about what is Git and GitHub before getting a little technical with it. Git is essentially a version control system that allows you to perform the tasks of version control on specific files and applications. And GitHub is a cloud-based hosting service for Git repositories. So one is essentially a software and one is a cloud-based hosting service. So the first thing you'd want to do is you'd want to look at having Git set up on your system. Most of the work done in Git and GitHub is done through the command line interface, which is the next thing I wanted to talk about. So the command line interface, I'll break away from the PowerPoint in a few seconds so that we could get a little practical and then come back to the slides so that you guys can see what I'm doing. So the command line interface is essentially an interface provided on the operating system, which allows a user to run specific commands. And most of the commands are well documented online. So if someone needs to find any information, they can easily search. So now what we need to do is that we need to first check to see if Git is already installed on your system as part of install and configuring. So I'll break away from the PowerPoint, and what we'll do is that Git allows you to check to see if it's installed by running a simple command. You can run git -- version. And if you notice, it says git version 2.11.0 -windows.1. So that means Git is installed on this system. However, if Git is not installed on the system, if it says something like Git is not a recognized command or so, you would essentially go to the GitHub website, the Git website, sorry. And the Git website you'd be able to access through the link shown here. You would download a version of Git which corresponds to your operating system. Once downloaded, you would have it installed. Through the normal means, you would have programs installed. So the first thing you'd want to do as part of after installation and setup, you'd want to configure some simple settings so that when you make changes or when you when you use Git in any manner, so that it knows who's it that did it on your system, and it knows at least an email address. So what you'd want to do is that you'd want to have an your name and your email set up. So in order to set up your name as part of configuring Git, you would write the command git config -- global user.name, and you put your name. In this case, my name is Narendra, N-A-R-E-N-D-R-A, and press enter. And secondly, we'd want to set the email. So it's a git config -- global user.email and my email. And then to ensure that your settings are as done, you could check to see all the configurations on your Git setup by using the command git config. So you could say git config -- list. And if you notice the last two lines, it shows my name is Narendra and my email address is as follows. So when I make a change using the Git versioning system, it essentially uses this information to keep track of who is it that they want. So I'll go back to the PowerPoint now. Right. So what we just covered would have been using the command line interface. We checked to see if Git was installed by using, to recap, by using the git -- version command. We looked at the process of installing Git by going to the online link and downloading and installing Git. We looked at configuring two settings within Git, which would have been your username and your user email. And lastly, we looked at viewing the configurations of your Git setup. So the next thing I would like to look at is that we'll now need to look at how is it you would sign up for GitHub online cloud-based system. So in order to register, you would go to the GitHub website. I'll break away from the PowerPoint here as well and show you exactly how is it we do it. So you would register by going to the link provided, which is github.com/join. And then you would be asked to provide some various information, and one of them would be your email address. And once you successfully sign up, you would need to do an email verification. So let's go to the link and see what it looks like. So I go to the GitHub website. Oh, I'm signed in, so let me sign out. Right, so on the GitHub website, you can hit the sign up button. And then if you notice here, it would ask you for an email address, a username, sorry. It asks you for an email address and a password. And then you'd have to, of course, ensure that it's not about spamming registrations. You'd have to verify your inputs. And this would essentially send an email verification to your email. And then once you have the email verification, your account will be activated. So the next thing I would like to talk about is understanding the Git workflow. The Git workflow essentially revolves around version controlling, as mentioned before. So picture this as looking at the diagram provided in the slideshow. You have a master code base of whatever application you're looking at. And let's say, for instance, a feature is requested to be done, or and a fix is requested to be done. First thing, what a developer would do, they would essentially clone the repository to their local system. They would then create a branch as noted in point 1 to identify the specific thing they're working on. And then from here, they would make their changes, edits, and so forth. Now, making changes and so in Git does not mean is automatically applied. You need to ensure that, and this gives you the power to be able to test and play around with what is it you're trying to get done. Now, once you're sure that everything is good and you're ready to accept that these are what I need to do, or these are the changes I need to make, you would then move on to the part 2, which would be where you add commits. And a commit essentially means that you have accepted the changes you've made and you want to commit them. Thirdly, you would do something called a pull request. A pull request would essentially be done so that the work done or the work you would have completed can be reviewed. So once you submit a pull request, the administrator of the master branch would get a notification, and then from there, they'd be able to verify and check everything that you did, which would have been in point 4, where they can review all the work done, understand the changes, and once you use the necessary standards of documentation, so it would be easy. And then one tip to point out, when you make commits, and so you won't write something like, let's say for instance, you won't look at the code base and make like 5,000 lines of code and then submit it as one commit. You generally work on smaller chunks so that once you submit a new feature or so, it would be easily reviewed and integrated within the system. Now, the power about Git is that once these changes would have been reviewed and the administrator would have accepted what you've done, before they even look at integrating what you would have done to the master code base, they can now deploy a code base using the changes you would have made and perform internal testing. And this allows them to verify that what you would have done is working as expected. And once the tests are successful as required, then they can finally integrate it into the master branch by using the merge feature. And then what happens is that you would have gone through the entire cycle where you worked on a feature or changed something, and you went through the review process, you went through the testing process, and now it's integrated within the master branch. So a next person that comes along to do something would essentially have access to what you have done. The next thing I want to look at is that I want to look at getting a little more technical now, because we would have talked about certain concepts when it comes to Git and GitHub for version control. So the first thing I want to look at is that I want to look at working with repositories. And we'll segue from here, from the PowerPoint as well, to get into a little technical details. So the first thing we'd want to do is that I'll go through the process of creating a repository using the command line interface on GitHub. And 2, I'll look at cloning an existing repository to your system. So let me come out here. So first, let's say, for instance, we want to create a new repository on the command line interface. What we can do oh yeah, sorry, I was getting a little technical issue here. Yeah, if you notice, once you're signed into GitHub, and you click here, you can add a new repository. So if I hit new repository, I can put in a repository name, description, and add a README. In this case, I could create a repository called test version control. And it checks to see the name to ensure that it does not conflict with anything else. And I create a repository. From here, what you can do is that you can, as noted by the instructions here, you have the repository set up on your GitHub account, but now you need to create the files and so on your system. So what you can do is that following the instructions here, you can now push the work you're doing to this repository, or you can sorry, here is the push to the repository, where you can add the you would add a remote origin and then set and use these commands. So I'll go through this process so that you guys would be able to understand how is it we have this done. So the first thing I would do is that I'll go to the command line. Let me just navigate to my desktop. And in my desktop, I have specific folders set up. I'll just create a folder for this purpose. Test. And let's say, for instance, now I have let me just open this folder so we can see what I'm doing as well. So I open this folder in a code editor. And let's say, for instance, I add a file called test or index.php. So I have this already set up on my system. And I just write a welcome message. Welcome. And there's so I have this file in a folder called this. So I'll just minimize this because we won't be using this anymore. And so where it says you can either create a new repository from the command line, or you can push an existing repository from the command line. So I don't have Git set up on that folder yet, which is the version control software. So what I have to do is that, right, so I'm in the right folder. The first thing I would want to do is I want to do a git init. So it's a git init. And it would essentially create a folder, that .git folder within the same folder that keeps track of or does all the functionality of the Git system. Now I have a file within this here called the index.php that I just created. And at the moment is not committed. So what I would need to do is I need to have this committed. This would have been like if I just created a new file and I'm working on a feature and I want to have it added. And I could check to see, I'll get more into status later, but I could check to see to verify, if everything is, or was a status by using the git status command. If you notice, it said that untracked files, index.php, which was a welcome message PHP file that we just created. So as following the instructions, what we'd have to do is that we'd have to add that file. In order to add that file, you'd use a git add command. You can either add everything within the directory using a simple identifier, which I'll show you just now, or you can add the individual file by saying git add index.php. Or you could have added all files in the directory by using a dot icon. So I'll add index.php, and if I check my git status, it'll show that a new file has been put to staging. Staging is essentially, and you could think about it as an area where you would have worked on something and accepted it, but you haven't committed it as yet. So now we need to commit it. So I'll do that by using the git commit command as shown on screen. So I'll say git commit -m. The -m is important because the -m is a flag which allows you to write a message that says, this is what I have done now or so. So now when another developer, when somebody is reviewing the work on the master code base, they would see all the changes on all the files being tracked by messages as well. So that, let's say for instance, I added XYZ feature and I committed, I would say, I just added XYZ feature so that the person would know this is what would have been changed. So I'll add a message and just call it first commit. And it would have been committed. So now I'll also set up the master branch on this Git repository by saying git branch -m master. Oh, I had a typo, sorry. So this should be in branch. And then I'll copy this here. And you can type it or so, but it'll be quicker for me to copy. I'll have to add the remote origin, which is essentially the remote repository where I'll be working with on GitHub to this. And lastly, I'll have to do a push to the remote repository. So I'll say git push -u origin, RIGIN master. It'll ask you for your credentials to ensure that you have access to this folder. Why this is important? Because you don't want nobody that can see your repository to have access. You would be able to set up permissions to all the contributors on your repository so that they can have the relevant access. So I'll put in my credentials, NARENDN, and my password. And if you notice, it said that it was writing objects of the various files, and it sent it to this here, and it submitted this branch to the online branch, which is master. Because we only created one branch. And if I refresh here, you would have seen that the index.php file we did with the welcome message is now here. So that is how you can set up a Git repository from the command line. So let me go back to the PowerPoint. Oh, sorry. So the second thing we'd want to do is that we'd also want to look at the process of cloning a repository. So this would be the first step that we look at was creating a repository on your computer, which is your local environment, and pushing it to the remote environment, which is GitHub. Now we'll look at, let's say for instance, you have a repository on GitHub and you want to bring it into your system. So for that purpose, I'll use the same repository. What I'll do is I'll just, I will delete the repository from my system, and then I'll come to here. So this would have been, assuming this would have been a repository I found online and I want to work with and get some work done on my system. What I would do is I would use a git clone command. And how you use a git clone command is by you find the repository you want to work with, or if it's your repository, you'd click. So I'm at a repository now. You click on this drop-down arrow, and it provides you with a HTTPS link, which you can copy. And then I'll go to, if you notice, this is my test folder I just created. I emptied it just now because we're going to clone back the repository to our local system. If I say git clone, and then paste in the link we copied before, it'll clone the repository. And now it's there with the welcome message that we created. So that would have been the process of creating a repository from the command line and GitHub, as well as cloning an existing repository from GitHub to your system. So next, I would want to move on to two concepts when it comes to GitHub. I'll be talking a little more about this. We mentioned cloning just now. I'll also be talking about forking. Now, forking and cloning are two important concepts when it comes to GitHub. So let me talk about clone first, because that's simpler. When you clone a repository, you take a copy from the online GitHub repository to your local system. But then when you fork a repository, what you do is that you take a copy of a code base from an online GitHub to your online GitHub. How this is important, or why this is used mainly? This is mainly used when it comes to open source development, because when you're working with an open source project, you generally won't be given access to write directly to that repository because you're not the owner of it, or you're not within the organization that owns it. So looking at our diagram here, if you notice, on the left, we have the concept of forking, which there's a central repository called the upstream, and you would get the information or the details from the repository using a fork or the fork command to your repository in GitHub. And you would submit any changes or any information or so from your repository on GitHub to the central repository using a pull request. And going to the right now, we're looking at the central repository, which have been a repository you have access to. And then we're looking at your local computer. So to get a code base or a version of the code base you're looking at from the central repository, in this case, your GitHub or your GitHub that you have access to your system, you would use the clone command. And in order to write files to the online repository that you have access to, you use a push. If going through the process earlier, you notice we did when we first created the repository in the command line and then sent it to the online repository, we did it using a git push command. And when we took a copy, or when we cloned the repository from the central repository to our local system, we did it using a clone command. So that's generally how that's done. The one difference to note when it comes to pushing and pulling is that pulling essentially goes through a different process from pushing. With pushing, you have direct access to write to the online repository. With pulling, I'll come back to this diagram here. If you notice point 3, when you open a pull request, what it does, as mentioned before, in point 4, there's a review process. So it's not written directly right away. The administrator or the person in charge need to review what you would have done. Then they would have had to test and deploy your changes to make sure what you've done is in line with the requirement of what they want to be done. And then once they're satisfied, then they would merge it into the master code branch. So let's look at working on some open source projects. So I created some examples for this, but before getting to that, want to look at how is it, or if, say for instance, you're interested in working on an open source project. I mean, how do you find an open source project? So I'll segue from the PowerPoint here as well. If you notice on GitHub, if I go to the home page, there's a tab called Explore. From here, I could find various different repositories that I could work with, as well as I'd be able to apply various, I can apply various filters. I could look at what's trending and so forth. I could look at by topics, you have different topics, and so essentially I could use the Explore feature to look at online repositories that are mainly open source and you can do work on. For this example though, or for this tutorial, we'll be going through the process of how is it you contribute to online or to open source development using the entire Git workflow of forking, then cloning, making changes, committing, and then creating a pull request. For this example, I created a repository here in my second GitHub account called, I just named it pull request tutorial because there's the concept we're looking at. When you go to a repository, there is the different branches you can look at, as well as there's an important tab called issues. Generally, when something is to be worked on, the administrator or the person managing the code base or repository, they would raise issues that they want open source contributors to work on. So I raised an issue. If you notice, I created a repository with an index page just saying, welcome to Code with Sam, introduction to version control using Git. However, normally when you create a GitHub repository, you generally have a README setup. So let me look at any sample project. So let's look at this guy's project here. If you scroll down, you see there's a README. Generally, what persons do is that a README is more of an introduction to the code base that you're working with. It allows you to put both textual and multimedia content as shown here, and it will generally tell you the various information about this repository, how to have things set up, how to do testing, and whatever you want to put so that persons working on the repository can have easy understanding. But if you notice on my demo, my test pull request, there is no README. So I raised an issue, a simple issue, just to go through the concept of how it's done. And when I go to the issue tab, and I click on, you would see on a normal repository, you'd see various issues as raised. So now we would, if once you click on a simple example in an issue, you see the details to it and anything that would have been done. So I set a message of exactly what was mentioned in that I created a repository and forgot to add a README. I would like someone to fork and clone this repository, create a README, and submit a pull request. Once the pull request comes to me as an administrator, I would review your README to verify that, okay, everything is set as required. I would test your README, and then I would essentially integrate it into my project. So this is on my second GitHub account. I'm currently logged into my main one. So the first thing we want to do, if we want to work on this project, we identify we want to address this matter here. What we would do is that we would click, if you look at the top right, there is watch, start, and fork. So, but in order to fork a repository, you would just need to be logged into GitHub. And let me just ensure that I haven't forked it as yet and did any work on it. This was pull request tutorial. Okay, it's not there. Right. So I would, oh, right. If it's fork, it would have shown as well. So I'll click fork. And then what this does is this takes a copy of the online open source repository to your online GitHub repository. So now, if you notice, it used the same naming convention, but my username, and it shows that it was forked from the source here. So the next step I would want to do is that I'll want to, let me just clear the screen here. I'll want to clone this repository to be able to work and build a README. So the first thing I'd want to do is that, as done before, I would click here and copy the URL, and then I would say git clone a URL, and would clone into the folder necessary. And then, if you notice, it created a folder called pull request tutorial. So I'll just go into that folder and I'll pull up pull request tutorial. So if you notice, it downloaded all the files that I would have forked as well. So let's say now I want to do or make a change on the issue that I'm addressing. So as requested by the issue, they wanted a readme.md file. And I'll just do a simple readme. There are other tutorials you could look at. How is it you format GitHub readme using text and multimedia and so, but for today's purpose, we won't be going into that. So I'll just put a heading using the hashtag sign and just say pull request tutorial TUT. Forgive my spelling. And I'll save it. So it's just a heading file. So let me minimize this. So the next thing, if you remember from our workflow, once you have something done, it's a change that has been made. So let's check the status. Notice it shows that we just added a file. So we now need to add it to the staging area. So we'll add it by saying git add readme.md. And if I check status here, I'll see that it was added. And it'll also tell you how to unstage it. So in case I didn't want to add this to the staging area to commit, I could say git reset head readme.md. And if I check the status, you'll see that it's removed from staging. But for this purpose, we want to have it added. Next, after adding the readme.md to staging, as mentioned before, we need to commit it now. So, okay, we finished the readme, we want to submit it. So I'll say git commit. Of course, don't forget to add your message. I'll say added readme.md file. So it would have been committed. Right, sorry about that. Yeah, so after I have it committed, I think I skipped a process. I didn't go into branches because I wanted to create a separate branch to have it submitted. Let me restart the process. Forgive me for this. Let me come out here. And I'll just go back the process so that we are in sync with what was it intended for us to do today. So I'll just clone back the repository. So let me go back to where I was. Go to my desktop, YouTube, CodewithSam, tests, the git clone, and I'll do the clone. And if you look back at in tests, I have the index file. So reiterating what we'd have spoken about so far, the first thing we want to do is that we want to set up a branch. That was a step I mistaken skip just now. So I'll set up a branch where I'll call it readme branch, or I'll give it a name. So in order to set up a branch, I'll say git branch, and I could say readme or read branch. Oh, sorry, I needed to go into the directory. Pull request tutorial. Right, so the branch is set up. And I need to switch to the branch now, so that I'm currently in the master branch, but I need to switch to the branch. So I'll say git checkout readme or read branch. So it says switch to branch, read branch. Now is it when I would make the necessary changes. So I'll add back the readme file. And in here, I'll just put back a pull request tutorial. And if I check the git status, you'll see that the file is on stage and it is tracked. All right, is on track. So I needed to add it to staging by saying git add readme.md. And now if I check git status, it'll show that it is in staging. And as mentioned before, we can remove it using the reset command when we want to commit it. So I'll say git commit -m added readme.md file. And then what I want to do is send them. So I finish working and make my changes, and then I committed my changes. Now I want to send my change to the online repository. Why is use branching is because it's important to use branch, which would be separate from the master code base, so that you don't trouble nothing, or you don't interfere with the master, which would be production ready code at most times. And what you're doing is mainly still in prototype phase. So I'll after committing my changes, I'll push to the origin. So I'll say git push origin, and the branch name that I'm pushing would have been read branch. And I'll ask me for my username. And password. And it does the upload. If you notice, it says it created a new branch from, and it sent it from readme to read branch to read branch. Once I check my Right, I didn't have to refresh. Even if I refresh, you would have seen it there. You'd have seen read branch has recent pushes from lesson. So it showed that work was done just now. So if you notice, I created work, but it's not reflected in the master code base because I didn't trouble the master code base. If, however, I can use this dropdown to change to the read branch, which would show all the different files within the branch. So now in the last phase, going back to our workflow, would have been after you fork, then you clone, then you make your changes, you commit your changes, you push your changes, and lastly, we need to do a pull request. And once you're on GitHub, you would see, and you committed a branch and you pushed it, you would see this compare and pull request. You can click on compare and pull request. And it would ask you, you would need to select which branch you're using, of course. So I already have read branch selected. And you can leave a comment to say what was it would have been done. So I'll just say as requested. I have created a readme.md file and submitted it. And I'll create my pull request. So now this pull request would have been sent through, and the administrator managing the repository that you initially worked with would have been able to see that pull request come through, review your code, and then perform your testing and necessary using deploying of the branch. And then once they're satisfied, they can be able to merge the changes into their system. So going back to the slides, we'd have went through the various steps of forking a repository, then cloning a repository. We created a branch, the read branch. We made our changes by adding the readme.md file. We committed our changes and set a message to it. We created our pull, and we just created our pull request. So there's essentially how is it you would contribute to online or open source projects available. That would have been a workflow. I also want to mention one last thing before we move ahead. Sometimes multiple persons are working on various different projects, and you want to ensure that any changes committed are added to, or any changes committed and merged are updated with what is it the code base you're working on. You don't want to be working with an old code base and then somebody submit some changes which was accepted, went through the process and was accepted, and then you stop using a version that was done before. So in order to keep a fork updated, what you would do is that you would, I'll do it right here because we have this forked and cloned already. Essentially what we would do is that you'd fork the repository. So let me see, I think I set up a separate one as well. Yeah, I did. So my repositories. Fork tutorial. I would have forked this repository a while now. And if you notice, in this repository, there is an index.html there, and it shows where it was forked from. Right. In this repository I'm working on, This is on my central repository, and this is the original one. So in my version, I have an index.html file, a readme.md file, and a JS folder. And if you notice, the messages of commits are shown here by users, where it says added main.js and so. So now on the original repository, someone would have committed and created a CSS folder for styling the web page. But my repository is not updated. So what I would want to do is that I would want to first, I'll do it in this. The first thing I'd want to do to have my repository, my online repository updated, I'd want to clone it by saying, let me come out to pull request and say git clone and the URL as done before. So that's done. The next thing I'd want to do is I'd want to add an upstream, which is essentially where it came from, the original, which would have been my other account here. So I'll do this by using the add upstream, remote add upstream functionality by saying git remote add upstream, and then pasting the URL for that one. Oh, sorry, I didn't change the directory. Fork. So the remote upstream is added, and then I can fetch from the remote upstream by saying git. Let me pull up my editor so you can see as it happens. So let me just close here, and I'll open test, so you can manage everything right here. So I'm using fork tutorial right now. I only have the one clone from my directory, which is the JS file, which has the index file, the readme.md, and the JS folder with the main.js. Now we want to, what we want to do is that we need to fetch from the upstream. So we already added the remote upstream address. So all we need to do is say git fetch upstream. Enter. And it'll fetch the upstream. And next, I would want to merge the upstream using either git pull or git rebase. I would generally like to use git rebase, because what it does is that it pulls the information from the remote upstream and then replace your work that you might have done on this local repository. So I'll say git rebase upstream, and the branch I'll be using is master. And if you notice, it now downloaded that style.css to my local repository, which would have come from the upstream, which is the second or the online repository in this case. But lastly, what we want to also do is we want to make sure that if we have any commits, we commit it. But in this case, we didn't have any commit. And what we want to also lastly do is make sure we push it to our online repository. So I'll just say git push origin master and putting back my credentials, and it would have sent the information. And if I go to my online repository and I refresh, there is the CSS folder. And if you notice, it shows that added CSS styling. And if I click on it, the nice thing about it is that it keeps track of all the different history, even if it is done by someone else. If you notice my second account, it shows that this person would have made this commit, and all the different, if there are various different work done, you would have seen, this person did that, this person did that, and so on. And you can also browse the different files. So that's it in regards to, coming back to the slideshow. That's it, mainly the various process of working with open source projects. So just to recap, what we did is that we covered using or finding open source project using the Git Explorer. We looked at identifying issues on a repository that may want fixing or so on. You might be interested in doing something. Just note, you don't necessarily need to only look at issues to make changes or contribute to online on open source projects. You might see a project that you're interested in. Let's say, for instance, you see open source code base for, was the most popular one, Linux, a Linux distro. And what you're thinking about doing now, you have this wild idea, or you have this very good idea in mind to implement a new feature. It might not be an issue, but then at the same time, what you're trying to do is that you're trying to do something new. So you can also add into the code base, go through the process, have it reviewed, and then you should be good to go. So we talked about the different steps of working, and I'll just recap it here. We talked about forking, as we mentioned before, which is taking a copy of a central repository owned by someone else, which is maybe an open source project, to your online repository. Then we also went through the process of keeping a fork updated. And these would have been the steps, which would have been to clone from your online to your local, add the upstream link, fetch from the upstream, merge or pull. Well, in my case, I use rebase. You can also use merge. And then push from the local to your online repository. Now, last thing I'd want to do. Right. So the last thing I'd want to do is I'd want to go just review the, I think I'll just review what we covered so far so that we'll have come to full circle with what we've done so far. So what I'll do, I'll fork a repository again for you guys. I'll clone it. I'll create a branch. I'll make a change. I'll commit a change. I'll create a pull request. And then it'll go for code review and it'll be merged. So the first thing I'd want to do, as reviewed before, is that, let's say, for instance, I don't have an example one I want to like that is owned by someone else, but let me see. So I'll just go through back the process of so that we're on board with everything, which would have been pull request tutorial that I set out to do today. So, and if you notice, there's a pull request shown up here, which is added readme. And the administrator of this project would be able to do this. So the first thing we'd want to do is that let me set up a new repository, a new location. I'll just say make directory pull or practicals. So to review what we did so far, the process of what we want to do is first, well, I already forked the repository, so I have access to it. But let's go over back the process so that we're clear on it. And I'll get rid of the repository that would have originally forked here. which should have been pull requests. I just delete this repository here. Right. So good. So let's remove. So to go to going over back the step. To recap and conclude, a user would first find an online project using the Explore tab. They would fork the repository and would create a copy of the online repository to their system. Let's say, for instance, I'll also do two things. If you notice on the original, they had the issue, of course, of no README, but then we want to also do two things. We might want to make some changes or so, and also create README for them. So after we have the repository forked, what we do is that we clone it using git clone command. Yep, let me just clear all this stuff. Say git clone, and I'll pull it down. Yeah, make sure I'm there. Right. So in my local environment, I have this, and I'll create back the README MD, and I'll just say pull request tutorial. And what I'll be able to do next is, so once the file is saved, then Git would say that, this file has now been put into staging. As I'll recall, we can use the git status command, which said the README file is not there. We can commit this change saying git commit. Oh, I'm on the master branch. I made a mistake again. I forgot to do the branch. Sometimes, as a developer, you tend to make mistakes. So that's not something that should be an issue. It's just that you just need to make sure that when it comes to writing and doing some specific tasks, you just make sure that you keep track of everything you do. So I'll just clone it back and git clone. Right. So what I'll do is that I'll create two branches to basically reiterate and go over everything with it. So the first thing I'd want to do is that I would want to create a branch called the read branch, which is git branch read branch. Oh, sorry, I needed to change pull request to run. Git branch read branch. And also, let's say, for instance, I'm also working. So this would have been if I'm working on an issue of the within the repository. Let's say, for instance, I also are working on a feature, and the nice thing about it is that you can create multiple different branches. Generally, you work on one branch at a time. So I would I'll go through the process of doing two things. So one, I'd look at the feature, and then two, I'd look at or the feature. The full process will be covered in the feature, in issue. Sorry. So once I have the branch set up, I'd switch the branch using the checkout command. So it's a git checkout, read branch, switch to read branch, and I'll add the changes, which is readme, and just add it in. Save it, check status. We'll say it's not tracked. I'll add it to, sorry, it's tracked, but it's not staged. I'll add it to staging. You can use the dot command to add everything. Is not committed, use the commit command, git commit commit -m, added readme.md. And once I have this here, I'll just push the branch. So I'll say git push origin read branch. And sign in back. And boom, there you have it. It's uploaded. When I come back here, I have my 2 branches. And then, of course, we can have our pull requests being done. So you see, you have a master and rebranch. You can do your pull requests as we went through before. So that kind of concludes the entire process that we set out to do today, which, as mentioned, would have been forking repository, cloning. So just to recap, forking would have been taking a copy from an online open source project to your online repository. Cloning would have been taking a copy from the online branch to, the online code base to your local repository. Creating a branch would have been creating a branch to work in a specific feature issue. Making changes, of course, would have been you implementing whatever it is you need to do, and then committing those changes so that it can be uploaded. And then you push it to the online repository, and then you do your pull requests. So at the moment, that concludes what we would have been looking to cover here today. We'd also be looking to go more in depth in further tutorials to cover in a little more details some of the useful Git commands, as well as things like, let's say, for instance, if multiple persons are working on a project and they try to do, if they try to do a merge or they try to do a pull request and there are conflicts and so, we'd be looking to also cover situations where there are conflicts in those areas. So Samantha, that concludes my presentation today. And these would have been, in case anybody interested wants to reach out to me or Samantha, these are our current LinkedIns. And lastly, as mentioned, I'd like for you guys to, of course, leave a like and subscribe on the video and channel. Back to you, Samantha.
Thank you very much, Narendra, for this heartwarming presentation. And I hope that our viewers enjoyed and is going to be able to learn at least something new and share what they learned with their friends as well. So if you guys have any questions, you can leave it in the comment section, or you can also hit us up on LinkedIn or even any of our social media pages. We'll be very much happy to answer those questions. So with that being said, I want to say thank you very much, everyone, for joining us this afternoon on Code with Sam and Narendra. And we're going to have our next episode next weekend. And do join us. Thank you very much.
Yes.
Bye.